Welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated first on 93 WIBC. Europe, the EU, they're at it again. And I know that we need to be a little more specific because Europe's always up to something stupid. In this case, it's environmental social governance being foisted, perhaps, again, on Americans. And to talk about that, we've got on Yaël, Ossowski, Deputy Director of the Consumer Choice Center. Good to have you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me, Tony.
Just break it down for us. Why does Europe think they can push ESG after it's already failed here in the United States?
Yeah, and you mentioned the ESG has failed. It's not only failed, but it's actually been totally abandoned in the U.S. We had the Securities and Exchange Commission that was trying to push this, various elements of the Department of Treasury, and it's pretty much been abandoned in the private sector too. BlackRock is no longer talking about this. But when you have the European Union, they're a bit behind the times, and they have something that's called the Corporate Sustainability Regulation. And what this does is it actually looks at any company that might be US, American, might be from Peru, Mexico, doesn't matter. If they have any facilities, any employees in the European Union, they're required to submit ESG data, environmental, social, and governance goals, to the European Union. And if they don't reach a certain threshold to instill that they're following the Paris Climate Accords, they could actually face fines of up to 5% of their global turnover. Now, the most important part of this is it's not just what's in Europe, it's your global operations.
Right.
So if you look at Indiana, a company like Eli Lilly, they've got facilities in Europe. They have to disclose their ESG scores around the globe. And if they don't, they're going to face that huge penalty. So another imposition from the European Union.
So the Europeans think that they can kind of gatekeep this in order to operate within the EU. You have to follow these Paris Climate Accord mandates so that even if the United States government has not signed on to this or has pulled out of this, Europe is still going to force this down the throats of the global operations of these corporations based out of the United States because they believe that companies should be forcing their weird climate goals and leftist social goals down on their consumers. That's a little that's a little out there.
It is a bit much. It is a bit much. And I think really what it is here is it's Europe trying to flex its own muscles. And it's something that we faced in the tech sector before. It's something that J.D. Vance talked about, not just at the Munich Security Conference. I think the other speech that's forgotten about is his speech on AI at the Paris Summit. And there he talked about American might, American innovation, AI, and a lot of the punitive regulations and fines that are coming from European regulators and how they're actually harming a lot of those American companies. So what's happening with the environmental and ESG scores, it's the same thing. You have American innovation, whether they be energy entrepreneurs, whether it be any kind of pharmaceutical company, any company that has any EU operations has to disclose this ESG score. Again, this is kind of the price you have to pay to play in Europe's backyard and to be able to offer things to consumers. But again, it's not anything that we're enforcing in the United States. And it's something that's certainly out of vogue just generally in the private market. So it's very strange to see the EU still cling to this. There are perhaps some chances that looking at what Trump is talking about and J.D. Vance, maybe this will be an opening for renegotiation with the European Union. But right now, we just got to stay vigilant.
So just out of curiosity, are more totalitarian regimes, or more, I should say, even into the South Pacific, the South Asian market as well? Do China, does Russia, obviously I know with the Russo-Ukrainian war, there are a lot of businesses that are not allowed to operate outside of Russia in the European Union. But I mean, there are a lot of Chinese firms. There are a lot of Indian firms from the South Asian market that are operating internationally. Do they have to follow the same rules, or is this just something slapped against the U.S.?
I mean, whether it applies globally, I mean, it is going to actually penalize some of those Chinese companies, but they just really don't have as much of a presence. So if you actually look at scale, if you look at the amount of companies, if you look at the size of the companies impacted, it will mostly be many of these U.S. firms that have European operations. And again, they're offering these things to European consumers. They're hiring European workers. It just happens that the headquarters are back home in the United States. But again, all of that activity in the United States or anywhere else is going to have to be disclosed to the government. They're going to have to figure out some way to do it. There are always ways that they can get around this ESG scoring. Believe me, there are plenty of consultancies. There are plenty of these people who wrote the rules, who are now advising on the rules. They can help you out. But just to show that this kind of stuff actually penalizes consumers, makes things more expensive, and just increases costs all along the way. So will it hurt China a bit? Somewhat, but really the hammer is coming down on the United States and all those companies who want to operate in Europe.
So when we talk about operation in Europe, there are kind of several tiers of operation that you could, I guess, interpret this. Is this just the kind of operation in which I am selling my goods in this country, or I have perhaps a section of retail space in this country? So the, insert brand name section of this store, or local stores and facilities operated by the corporation, or there is a division of this company that operates in, say, Switzerland, who has several firms that operate within. Those are the kind of the tiers. Whom does this apply to and whom does it not? Because my China question was obviously Huawei, their phone manufacturers, they sell a lot of phones to Europe. Is that going to penalize consumers there? I guess I'm just looking for a little more clarity on how this gets meted out by the EU.
So I don't want to get into the sort of meat packing of European regulations because I would take all night. But put simply, there are just basically three criteria. You need to have at least 250 employees in the European Union. You need to have a net turnover of 40 million euros, let's say 35 million US dollars. And you have to have over 20 million euros in assets. That's it. Any of those two criteria, then you're required to give your ESG score.
Is the 20 million in assets in the continental EU, or is that globally?
It would have to be in the continental EU.
Okay.
So if you think a company like Apple, they would do it
globally. If you don't play by the ESG rules, they can penalize you on 5% of your global earnings, but they're not counting global assets. This is just reeking of like corporate backhand double right for me. At least a little bit, that some of the biggest players. So again, maybe not in this case Eli Lilly, but I'm thinking just off the top of my head, Apple or whatever. Mm-hmm. If they are doing you should frame it this way, so we don't necessarily say that we have this many assets in the EU, although I guess if they're stockpiling things over on the continental EU side, they would.
Yeah, and they're going to find creative ways around it. Again, this is within the European Union. So in your example, Switzerland would not count. So does that mean that everything gets moved to Switzerland or everything gets moved to Serbia or Liechtenstein?
Switzerland popped into my head just because I know that the Swiss have a lot of national firms that operate out of Bern and Lucerne. And so while not a part of the EU, that just when I think of a European country that has oodles, canoodles, and toaster strudels of international firms operating in it, maybe for this exact reason, the Swiss come to mind.
Yeah, a lot of it is also Ireland. So a lot of the tech companies have their headquarters in Ireland. You have a very low corporate tax rate, which again has been part of the consternation. You've had plenty of huge fines against Meta and Apple and all the other companies because they said that Ireland did not tax them enough. So there's just been this is just the latest kind of punching bag. And I think this is the opportune moment to say, look, the US and the European Union, look, we have common agreement much more than with China or Russia. So it actually should be the time for getting rid of a lot of this stuff, finding collaboration and cooperation, figuring out how we can do trade.
Facilitating the economic development through the free market between the two entities, being the EU and the United States, not creating a series of hoops for who should be our economic partners to jump through.
Absolutely. I mean, we don't have a free trade agreement between the US and Europe. Not that we need that, actually written down. Ideally, you would just have lower customs barriers between them and try to do it. But Europe has been very, very stuck on this. They signed this free trade agreement with Canada something like 12 years ago. It's not even fully ratified. So there's just a lot of stuff in the EU that makes it very complicated. It takes a long time to process these regulations. And that's why while the private market has basically given up on ESG, the EU is still fixated to this. They're still talking about the Paris Climate Accords. They're still figuring out ways that they can penalize based on ESG goals. The market has moved on, but unfortunately our government institutions won't, particularly coming out of the EU.
This is one of the dangers of, as a nation, giving up your economic negotiation ability to these supranational organizations. I mean, the League of Nations was such an abomination and a failure in its short-lived time. And now to see the UN, of course, failing in its myriad ways, the EU trying to link and band together to somehow take much and give back to the Europeans little is, I think this is a great argument in favor of why it's a huge failure, because the average European doesn't benefit in any way, shape, or form. Even if the ESG was a good policy, the way that it's implemented is so silly. I mean, it being a bad policy, it goes hand in hand, but like the concept behind it just feels so strange that it just, again, rings the particular warning siren of this is why you do not give up national sovereignty ever.
And you had a very good use of the term supranational, by the way. Kudos for that.
Oh, thanks. But, yeah. So many don't. No one knows the word supra anymore. You got to work it in.
You did a very good job there. But I think it's an opportune time for Trump and Vance because we want to have, more trade. We want to have a booming economy, and we're going to need global markets. I mean, that's just how it's going to work. That's how we're going to have productivity. There's plenty of energy as well. If we just think of liquid natural gas, if we think of all the oil that'll be pumping out of our soil, drill, baby, drill.
Yeah, imagine how rich Louisiana would be if it was able to export massive amounts of cheap natural gas through LNG over to Europe instead of Europe buying it from Russia.
And it's very true. And, right now Europe is still buying a lot of its gas from Russia, even though it's coming through proxies via India and other countries. So if you have just all the things that the US has, resources, capital, technology, just Europe is a perfect market for that. And I think the Trump and Vance administration have the perfect opportunity to say, look, if we're going to sell our goods to you, you're going to have to relax some of your rules. You're going to have to do it on digital stuff, stop finding our companies, get rid of a lot of these regulations that get away with free speech. And also, all of this corporate ESG mandate is not going to fly. And I think the US has enough muscle to do it right now. And I think the Europeans, looking at the German election, looking at a lot of the upheaval, they're going to have to listen and probably change something. So I actually see a very positive aspect of this. Good changes right now on the continent. We'll see what happens, though, in the next few months and weeks.
Well, when those regulations either rise or fall, we'll make sure to bring you back on. I don't think Stephen Ken will mind too much and see a little bit more as to what's going on in the international consumer market and how that's going to affect, I'm sure, international trade for the next couple of decades. Yaël Ossowski, thanks for joining us, Deputy Director over at the Consumer Choice Center. Thanks again.
Thank you, Tony.